Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Laura with Connect My Brain. Sorry, I've been a little bit under the weather, so if my voice sounds a little cracky today, I apologize, but let's just move on. We have been talking about stress, and today, what I want to do is I want to really funnel this to the pediatric population because that is primarily the work that I do, but we do help adults as well. Primarily, the adults like to come in for primarily the adults come in for functional nutrition and neurofeedback. But we have a full program when it comes to kids, and my passion is really to help them get their childhood back. And working with a child is probably one of the greatest things I think I've ever done in my whole life. And having my own kids has been the greatest gift. As a mom, I love being a mom. But today our children are really under a struggle on so many different levels. Recently, one of my podcasts got kicked off of YouTube because we were talking about the things that are going on in the world as it relates to having things put into your body. I'm choosing my words carefully. And unfortunately, we're being robbed of the truth. And it's small podcasts like mine, it's other individuals on the internet primarily that we can get solid truth information, or at least you can hear things that maybe you haven't heard somewhere else, and it will get you to start looking deeper. And I really, really, really do encourage you to look deeper. Don't just take my word for it. We are in a time that we have to give ourselves information. And the reason I really wanted to focus on stress at this juncture is because this has been going on for so long. This is 3 years. We're going 3+ years. And the amount of change that is occurring, first of all, as adults, we have no point of reference because we've never gone through this before. Imagine what it is for our children. And we are little, we're the guidepost for the child, especially the child under the age of 8.5, whose subconscious mind is still forming. When I talk a lot about brain mapping and what I find in a developmental assessment, the point I really like for parents to understand is what you're seeing right now has influenced how that little one's brain has actually turned on. What you see in your child that is maybe causing you to ask yourself what is going on for your child has now been shaping their brain. When you come into this world, you are fully formed, but you are not fully functioning. And it is what you go through in your developmental acquisition, your developmental milestones, how you go through acquiring sound, vision, communication, social, how you're learning to adapt. The parent caregiver is the role model. The child is like the little duckling. And then their perception is what then wires up their brain. One of the things that really impacted my work as a clinician was learning primitive reflexes. I love that now that word primitive reflexes is a very common word, and people are at least more familiar with it than they were even. The primitive reflexes are the hard wiring to your child, meaning what's needed to be there in order for everything else to build upon it. But they have a timeline. And if it goes past the timeline, it can lock the child into the brain stem, which means that the higher brain is not going to take over as expected. And higher brain, when we use those words, it means executive function. It means planning. It means reasoning. And in order to make sure that that development goes forward, you got to release that brainstem. Also down in the brainstem, now it doesn't mean that we never use that, because we do, but it isn't supposed to be running the show. When it runs the show, we get these different arousal states. And it means that we've either got a system that is overly aroused or under aroused. And in other podcasts, we defined where that comes from, and that comes from the primitive reflex called the Moro reflex. And the Moro reflex literally hard wires arousal, CO2O2 reflex, and the sympathetic nervous system. In common words, arousal. Does the baby wake up rhythmically like it's supposed to every 2.5 to 3 hours? You use glucose up in the brain very quickly. A newborn should be waking up about every 2.5 to 3 hours. So it's a rhythm, but it's a state of survival. Is the baby getting the message that I need to eat, I need to get glucose, I need to be cared for? If this doesn't integrate correctly, we can have a state on either end of over-aroused, under-aroused, and I often associate this with, like, attention deficit would be an under-aroused system, and then an attention hyperactivity is an over-aroused, because the arousal factor is what is connected to advancing, maturing this idea of attention. Moro reflex was designed to alert the caregiver parent, I need you, pay attention to me. And then as we raise our baby, going into being a toddler, teaching them how to be potty trained is the initiation of learning how to pay attention to self. Well, if we've never been attended to and we don't know how to pay attention to self, how do we pay attention to somebody else? So it is these foundational pieces that are instrumental in helping your child learn how to self-regulate. Self-regulation is what we're really wanting for them. If they self-regulate, when they go into a classroom, they're not distracted by light, sound, pencil dropping, whatever it is. They can pay attention to the teacher. Self-regulation, my body knows where it is in my seat, and I don't have to spend the energy trying to figure that out, which is going to distract me from my teacher. Self-regulation means I know how to enjoy others. I can innately socialize. The second one, CO2O2 reflex, first of all, has a very high impact for survivability for our newborns. And unfortunately, if a baby comes into this world and they're under aroused, this is what's related to when children maybe stop breathing because that reflex is not functioning like it's supposed to. And when it does, it would interpret there's too much CO2 in my body. Take a big, deep breath because that's what the reflex physically generates. When a baby has a Moro reflex, it literally startles, takes a big, deep breath, opens its body, which opens its lungs. That air goes in and it begins to create homeostasis. If I'm under aroused and I don't get that, then I get too much CO2. If that happens long term, unfortunately, this is related to SIDS, sudden infant death. What does it look like today? Part of my assessment is literally looking at the child's endurance level. And I really have seen, especially over the last 3 years, and that also coincides that we were covering their faces all the time, but they're not getting enough oxygen. And it only takes 20 seconds for your brain to say, excuse me, I'm not getting enough oxygen, to elicit a fight or flight response. So this is an innate response. This is a physiological response. It happens to all of us all the time. And when I do a physical assessment of endurance, the child's oxygen levels are not going up as they should. Their heart rates are either going too high or too low. And then when it's supposed to normalize, it's not. So if they don't have physical endurance, how are they supposed to withstand learning, engagement, thinking? I was doing an assessment the other day. on a 12-year-old. And literally during part of the eye assessment, he was falling asleep. And some of these kids do walk around with an ADHD label, but then when you actually are looking at them, they're falling asleep. And there's actually been some research that's coming out that talks about that there is a link between attention issues and chronic fatigue because they're not sleeping well. They may go to bed, they may get up, they may be, there 8, 9, 10 hours, but is it quality? Do they wake up feeling rested and ready to go? Quality is just as important as the amount of sleep. In fact, it is more important. There are physiological processes that go on when we are sleeping that are imperative to brain health. I'm going to deep dive into this. I'm going to call it brainwashing, but I'm going to deep dive into this, especially when we get to the adult part of the stress. So I'm going to break the next 3. This will be pediatrics. The next will be young adults. And then the next one will be older adults. Brainwashing is when we are sleeping, literally our brain bathes itself to get the toxins out. And if we're not getting deep restorative sleep, our brain is not doing this. And then what's happening is our brain is being taxed. It's stressed. That stress over time is associated with dementia. Now, remember what I said. This particular podcast is on pediatrics, but it is part of their life too, because what it may manifest for them is brain fog. And years of brain fog can also be tied to early degenerative changes in the brain. The third thing that Moro really focuses on is the sympathetic nervous system. And that is our fight or flight. And what we really want to try and understand about this word, because unfortunately, and I see it all the time, we use this as if it's not a real event. And it is. It is a real event. And we are designed to have stress. The sympathetic nervous system, AKA fight or flight, is responsible for many physiological functions. Like every single time you take a deep breath, that is your sympathetic nervous system, and it is countered with you exhale via the parasympathetic nervous system, rest, feed, breed. Yes, breed. Think about the connections to these words. Are you having trouble conceiving a baby? Your autonomic nervous system, which is the collection of both sympathetic and parasympathetic, if it is not balanced, you're not balanced. If you're not balanced, it is not easy to conceive a baby. Babies are conceived in a homeostatic or balanced environment. So it's important to understand how far reaching that sympathetic response really is, and also what it does to brain health. When you have a fight or flight action, it is going to change blood flow in the brain. It's going to pull it away from your frontal lobe, and it's going to fire up the back of the brain, where we work with our cerebellum to handle smooth movement and get our arms and legs going, and visual cortex as well. And we're gonna throw the blood back there. So anytime that our body, think about it, anytime our body can have that kind of power, that it can redirect blood flow, that's huge. I recently purchased a laser, and I'm so excited to be using this in the office. And I want to throw this pearl in because I'm working with an elderly woman right now, and the chronicity is really a big part of what I'm trying to educate today on. And this woman's health has been in a chronic decline. And the two systems that have been really impacted are circulatory and lymphatic. When we have chronic stress, and stress is mechanical, like we talk about developmental milestone acquisition, it is balance, coordination, but it's also chemistry. What's going on in the chemistry? And if we are not clearing toxins out of our body, all we're doing is filling the bucket. And that bucket can only take so much. Now, it has great ability to try to clear itself out a little bit, just like I was talking about brainwashing. And if our elimination systems are working properly, and we're supporting, especially if we've got an MTHFR genetic mutation, and we're supporting our methylation pathway, we have great ability to get toxins out. But if those systems are overburdened, and they keep getting overburdened, and I see it even in the pediatric population, there's just so much that the body can handle before that bucket tips. But yesterday we did maybe 4 or 5 minutes of laser, red light laser. And I watched this woman's disposition change right in front of my eyes. It was magnificent. We did her circulatory system and her lymphatic system. And what that would do is raise the body's energy to get back online the way that it's meant to function. It's so exciting to have tools to help individuals get their lives back. I mean, that's just everything to me. So what I wanted to do with breaking down Moro again, because I just can't emphasize this enough. It's not just about children. Every adult has had this reflex as well. Every adult should have integrated this reflex. If you're an individual and you believe that you've got a very heightened, startled response, the same thing is true for you. And the longer it goes on, it can cause the reflex to take over again. These reflexes still exist, but they're inhibited after 4 months after that baby has been born. They're meant to be inhibited. But when the body becomes overly taxed, they can reemerge. And it can be one of the biggest links that is keeping a stress response in charge. So while I wish we had another place to put our videos right now, I am sharing my screen. So I do encourage you to go over to Dr. Laura Hanson's YouTube channel so that you can see this. If you don't and you prefer to call the office so that I can maybe just give you a copy of one, I'm also happy to do that. But when I really got into reflexes and I was trying to educate parents on this Moro response, I was so fortunate to find this piece of equipment called a Neuroinfinity that was created through a marvelous man, Dr. Richard Barwell, and Thought Technology. And I remember the day that he and I got together. He was so excited because he needed somebody to teach on primitives in his class, and that became me. But this particular tool gave me the way to quantify if that child was still in a brainstem imbalanced arousal state and quantify it to the parent. So for the podcast audience, the screen that I am sharing, there's a page on it, and at the top there are the words heart rate, temperature, respiration, skin conduction, shoulder muscles left and right. And then underneath that is an S and an R. The S stands for stress and the R stands for recovery. When we go through a stress response test, when we do a stress response test on an individual, they go through 4 stressors. The first one is just adaptation. How are you responding to a new environment? The second one is a cognitive challenge. The third is crazy noises. And the fourth one is all about breathing patterns, because these are things that can generate changes in heart rate, temperature, respiration. Skin conduction is moisture, like sweating when you're stressed out. And then muscle tone, because you elevate your shoulders even minutely when you are in a stress response. So what I'm showing on this is there is all this red under every single category, which reflects that based on the individual's age, which this is a little person, this is a 6-year-old. What is the response by that 6-year-old according to what should happen? We're not going to call it normal. We're just going to call it typical. And under every single one of our categories of heart rate, temperature, respiration, skin conduction, muscle tone, there's double red bars, meaning I didn't handle the stress well and I didn't recover well. I'm 6. What in the world does that do to the baseline of that child? Then as we go to the next page, it shows us what the brain was doing. And I'm going to just highlight that part for right now. So, what's across the top of the page are different colored bar graphs, and there are brain waves theta, alpha, SMR for sensory motor rhythm, and beta. When you experience stress, your beta brainwave should go up. When you recover, it should go down. So beta is going to handle the stress that's in front of you. Then what should happen is theta, alpha, and SMR should be the opposite. Theta should go down during times of stress. Alpha should go down in times of stress. And SMR should go down in times of stress. Then during recovery, that is where theta, alpha, SMR, those bar graphs should go up. So if you're looking at this test, you see colored bars. The first one reflects adaptation. The green reflects cognitive. The navy blue reflects the crazy sounds. And the pink reflects the purposeful breath. So what we call the bar graphs going up and down is engagement, meaning that the brain does know how to turn on and turn off like it's supposed to. And this is really what I wanted to highlight today for our pediatric population. I have done thousands of these. I have been doing this work since 2008. So I have done so many. And the first thing I began to notice was, regardless of what label this child presented with, it didn't matter if it was ADD, ADHD, PDD, OCD, anxiety, depression, elemental OP, it didn't matter. They all had this problem with engagement. And that's huge, because I told you at the beginning of this, when it comes to how this child's brain is actually getting wired up, it is based on their early developmental processes. And we can't get that feedback from them. We can't get the feedback from them, but when you do a developmental assessment, you're looking specifically for, you are supposed to be doing things at certain times. Are you accomplishing them? And what does it look like? Is it typical? Did the child crawl on its hands and knees, not scoot on its bottom, not walk on its hands and feet? Did that child get up and walk at 12 months, not at 16 and not at 18? This to me is so alarming that our culture today is beginning, our healthcare culture today is beginning to revise what's the expected time for a child to do something. And these children are going to be delayed, because if somebody writes it down and says it's perfectly fine, but that's not how the brain works. We can't just automatically change something. We have to realize that there are known movements, sequences, and timelines that we should be able to see that child do what they're expected to do. And the longer you wait, the harder it is to help that child. It's not that it can't be done. I never, ever, ever want to take away hope, but it's harder. Once we get closer to 14, it's more like if I was working on myself or another adult. It's thousands and thousands of repetition. And the world that we live in today wants to press a button, take something, and poof, we're all better. And that's just not how it works. If you truly want resolution, you got to be willing to roll up your sleeves and do the work. The younger your child is, the faster things can go. If you're already asking yourself, is my child on target? Go look at my Dr. Hanson's developmental milestone guideline. Watch the podcast or listen to the podcast over off of the website or on Spotify or Apple or even Google. But go download the developmental milestones. And that will show you. It doesn't have all of them on there because you try to condense things down. But it will help you open your eyes and realize there is a timeline. And that's exactly what I'm looking at when I perform an assessment on a child. Can you do what you should be able to do? When children start making transitions around that 7.5, almost 8 mark, when your child is reaching that mark, you have literally gone through an enormous amount of maturation to the brain. And especially when you see that your child's personality has even changed a little bit. Maybe before it was just some emotional dysregulation, and now literally they're either like very angry or fighting because they're frustrated, but they don't know how to tell you, hey, I'm frustrated because I can't get my body to figure stuff out. That's frustrating for them, especially for little boys. If you see this, don't put it off. We need to get our children on track, and we need to make this happen as fast as possible. One thing you can do for your child to kind of do a little quick test is see if your child lateralized correctly. That word lateralize is telling us that the brain, when it went through its growth and pruning process, putting those developmental specialty centers on the right and on the left, that how well did that process occur? This has a lot to do with when children are identified as dyslexic, but it also is any type of coordination of the brain. When you don't get organized correctly, then you don't lateralize correctly, and that means that you do not declare dominance on one side. Now, if you decide to do this little test, and you could certainly do it on yourself, you don't want to overly educate. You just want to see what it's like. So, for example, I lay a kaleidoscope down on a desk and say, just look through that with your favorite eye. It's very interesting. Some kids they pick it up and they look at it because they have no idea what it is. But maybe even a paper towel roll or a toilet paper roll, making like a kaleidoscope or a telescope, and just notice what hand do they use to pick up the object? What eye do they place it to? Then take that away and lay your phone down and ask them to put that up to their favorite ear. You probably already know what hand they write with, but notice, can they hold their pencil in the pencil grip? So for the podcast audience, I'm literally holding up a pen the way that we're supposed to hold them. So many kids today are still locking their writing instruments in a fist, and that is related back to the palmar reflex. So this information really helps us understand how well your child's brain got organized. The last one is to roll a ball towards their foot and have them kick it. Every one of those, the eye, the ear, the hand, the foot, should all be on one side. Children that are typically identified as dyslexic will typically have one or both of the special senses opposite of the hand and the foot. So this information is not organized and it flips things around. It also relates to auditory processing. If your brain's set up that everything should be processed on the right side, but you're pulling it in on the left, there's a lot of confusion. Have you ever been on your cell phone and you heard yourself talk after you spoke? A child with auditory confusion, that is their world. And they sit there and they take more time because the sound is going in on one side, but it's got to go be delivered on the other side and then brought back and interpreted. And this delays the response. When the response is delayed, especially in a situation like a classroom, and the teacher is instructing the child, go put your homework in the bin, and the child is standing there because they're still trying to hear it. And then the teacher doesn't see the child move fast enough. So now the teacher comes back with that second punch. Hey, come on, go get your homework. Now the child has a stress response. We have really noticed in the office, the children, it really does happen so early that everything they are taught so early on is making them feel, am I doing it right or am I doing it wrong? And I believe we carry this with us our whole lives because I see it with adults. If we did a developmental assessment and helped the world, the parent, the teacher understand what's going on for that child, it could really change the entire environment and the learning process for that individual. Under the age of 8.5, it is so easy to flip an ear or flip an eye. It does get harder, and you have to make a conscious decision if you want to try to flip it after we have gone through some significant maturation. But there are things that we can do to really encourage better function. But we can't figure that out until we do the developmental assessment. Well, thanks for tuning in today. I hope that this was informative. I hope you got some great information out of it. And again, if you ever want to ask a question, sometimes if you just say, I'm wondering, is this where my child should be right now? I'm wondering about myself. I have some of these things that you talk about. It's a simple consultation. We get on the phone and we talk about it. And those are complimentary to you. So just send in a website request. Be sure and tell me when you're available so that we can cut down the back and forth of trying to arrange a schedule. Please share this podcast with your friends, with your family. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, the website is connectmybrain.com. The office number is 678-501-5174. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and I hope that you have a very blessed day. Be well.